Chapter 10. Present. Loud, bellowing country music caught my attention as I started down the stairs. It was a slow song. I knew it well and didn't have to look out to see where it was coming from. Hot summer night, sappy country music shaking our windows. It can only mean one thing. Katie and Drew were on the mend. "Come on, Katie!" I shouted over the music, making my way across the dark yard to where they'd parked Drew's pickup between our properties. She was swaying against Drew in a pale pink sundress that cut off mid-thigh. Her blonde hair was pulled up but had fallen in pieces down her golden tan neck. "Drew!" I tugged his shirt sleeve as Katie ran her hand through his wavy brown hair. It had grown out since I'd last seen him and nearly reached his chin. "Give me a hand." Drew wasn't quite as tall as Thomas, but he was taller than Katie's 5'5" and had sun-kissed tan from working his parents' cattle ranch. He gave me a sheepish grin, revealing the cutest dimple on his left cheek as they climbed into the bed of his truck to continue their dance. "You know better than anyone that once Katie gets going, there ain't no stopping her." "Give it a rest, Breland," Katie sang, spinning under Drew's arm. "It's summer. Do you remember what that means?" Her grin was contagious as she leaned down, crooning her finger for me to join them. "Come on," she said, her eyes bright as she stood back up and bounced on her feet. "This is our jam, remember?" How could I forget? She hadn't stopped singing it all week. "I don't have anyone to dance with," I sighed, grabbing her hand for a boost. "I got you, Breland," Drew said, grabbing both of us by the waist and lifting us off our feet. The way Katie's dress rode up, I was suddenly very thankful for my cutoffs. It was things like this that kept getting Drew dumped. They weren't officially back together yet. Katie liked to stretch things out, string him along a little while after he'd screwed up. I don't think Drew intended to hurt Katie. He just had the kind of face girls flock to, like a newborn puppy in a store window. His big blue eyes were lethal weapons, but I swear the boy didn't even know they were loaded. So maybe he needed to learn to keep his hands to himself, and that not all friendly hugs are meant to stay friendly. But as far as I knew, he'd never actually cheated. I sat on the side of the truck as soon as I could politely disentangle myself from Rusty's arms and stared up at the stars. The sky was beautiful when it was clear, stretching for miles, a bright oasis of lanterns. I'd spent countless nights under them dreaming about my future, where it might take me, who I might meet there. "Thomas!" Katie called over my head, waving her hands over her head as if he could miss her standing in the back of a pickup with music loud enough to wake the dead. I refused to turn around. He'd had enough of my attention today. Enough for a lifetime. "Yes, you!" Katie laughed. "Do you see any other boys named Thomas out here? Come and dance with Breland." What? She did not just say that. Drew wouldn't have to worry about getting back in her good graces because I was going to kill her with my bare hands. "No," I said, horrified, looking over my shoulder. Thomas was still dressed in his work clothes, dirty, faded jeans that, as much as I hated to admit, fit him a little too perfectly in all the right places, and a mud-splattered white t-shirt. "I'm sure he's tired, Katie. He's been working in the hot sun all day." "Sun schmun," she sighed, adding another nail to her. She gave him a bright smile. "Yeah, come on, man." Drew waved him over, popping the top on a can of Coke. "It ain't right to have a pretty girl sitting all by her lonesome." "Right," Katie chuckled. "Come and get baby out of the corner." Really? Did we have to drag Dirty Dancing into this? I was going to kill them both before the night was over. Thomas stood by the tailgate with his hands in his pockets, watching the spectacle Katie was creating as she spun around to the music with her hands raised in the air. "You don't have to," I said, hugging my chest when his eyes moved to where I sat next to Drew. "I'm perfectly fine where I am." Thomas smirked, his eyes zeroing in on my pouty lip. I quickly transformed it into a small smile. No need in having him think I was upset about him. It was Katie whose head was on the chopping block. "I'm pretty dirty," he said, dusting his hands on his pants. "Breland don't mind," Katie grinned. "She likes 'em dirty." No, she did not just say that. "Katie, you better give your heart to Jesus because your butt is mine," I hissed under my breath, giving her a look I hoped would set her ablaze. I swung my legs over the tailgate and hopped down to stand in front of Thomas. It was clear there was no getting out of this. I wasn't about to make a fuss in front of him. It clearly meant nothing to him, so why should it mean anything to me? A dance with an old friend. It didn't get any more cliché than that. His eyes moved from my bare feet over my two long legs to the well-fitted tank top that I'd pulled on with plans of going to bed early. It showed a little more cleavage than I was comfortable with, at least in front of him. When his eyes finally reached mine, I would have sworn there was a challenge hidden there in the depths. Stealing my hands by my sides, I silently challenged him right back. If this was happening, he was making the first move. No way was I going to step out on a limb only to have him break it. He dusted his hands against his jeans again before taking a half step forward and placing his hand gently on my hip. His touch seared through me like a hot branding iron. Our eyes locked as I moved to close the distance between us. Then, the music stopped. "Damn battery," Drew muttered. "I just had it checked." Thomas withdrew his hand as I turned to look at Drew, who'd hopped out of the cab and started for the hood. "I need to get some rest anyway," Thomas said, scratching the back of his head and taking a step backwards toward the house. "It's not even 10, Katie complained to his back. "What's your rush, Grandpa?" "Some of us have to work in the morning," he called back with a wave of his hand. "Right," she called. "Breland said you were a real buzzkill now." "Katie!" I grabbed her arm in a vice grip. "I did not. Why would you say that? He's going to think I really said that." "Good to see you again too, Katie. Good night," Thomas said over his shoulder. Katie rolled her eyes and went to the front of the truck with Drew. He traced the problem to the cab light Katie left on. This happened all the time. Anyone else would have replaced the battery by now, but not Drew. He was a modern-day Scrooge when it came to replacing things. It drove Katie crazy, but he wouldn't throw anything out until it was completely useless. Katie was busy telling him just that when a blue Mazda pulled onto the grass next to his truck. Chase Owens. He and Drew had been best friends since Chase had moved here last year. Katie tried to set us up, but there was nothing there. No spark. No chemistry. Nothing. He wasn't a bad-looking guy. His black hair, that he usually wore long like Drew's, was cut short in a crew cut, and his equally dark eyes landed on me the moment he stepped out of the car. He'd played football all through high school and had spent hours in the gym, which showed in the stretched, short sleeves of his shirt. He'd mostly dated the cheerleader type in school, which made me question why he'd showed interest in me. I'd never been one for pep and school spirit, choosing to spend my spare time on the farm or in the library. No, it wasn't Chase's looks that kept me at bay. He was just so goofy. Sometimes goofy can be funny, but not with Chase. He was funny like a 5-year-old who told the punchline before the joke. The worst part was that because people laughed, he hadn't stopped. "My heart be still," Chase said, rounding the truck in a pair of cut-off blue jean shorts and flip-flops. "Katie didn't mention you were here." "It's my house," I rolled my eyes, moving over to make room for him on the tailgate. "How's it going, Chase?" I asked as he sat close enough to brush my arm. "It just got a lot better," he smiled, pulling me into a one-armed hug and leaving his arm around my shoulders. At least he had on deodorant. Drew gave him an exasperated glance and headed up to my house for help. "Maybe it was Memphis!" Katie screamed, more than saying the new Patti Loveless song we'd been listening to before the battery died, making up for the lack of radio. "Maybe it was... Do you think this song's about Elvis?" she asked just as Drew reappeared with Thomas, who'd clutched a pair of jumper cables in his fist. "It doesn't say it is, but it has to be. Who writes a song about Memphis and doesn't mention Elvis?" "That's who it makes me think of," I agreed, watching Thomas as he leaned over the left side of the hood and helped Drew attach the cables. Katie and Chase were both singing now, moving me in a sway that in no way went with the beat of the song. They had zero rhythm, but they were having so much fun I couldn't help but join in. Drew plugged his ears as he slid into the cab and fired the engine. Thomas glanced at us on his way to the house, and it almost looked like he smiled, but it could have just been a shadow. We sang the chorus through twice before Drew slammed the hood and called for Chase, who was taking advantage of his goodnight hug. I mouthed to Katie for help, but she just grinned and gave me a thumbs up as Chase's hand rubbed the length of my back. "You staying with me or Breland?" Drew called impatiently from the truck window, the brake light shining across my leg. "Do I get to pick?" Chase asked eagerly, giving me the eyes. Unfortunately for him, his eyes did little more than make me wish I were already in the house. "Not on your life," Katie said, pulling my arm until he let go. "I'm staying with Breland. You boys get out of here." She really was playing hard to get with Drew. Katie had been sleeping over at Drew's since the beginning of the year. His parents treated him like an adult since he'd turned 18, which was more than I could say for mine. Mom and Daddy were watching TV when we went inside. I looked at them expectantly before heading to the kitchen. Katie and I'd planned a movie night, and they needed to skedaddle. I grabbed a bag of chips while Katie made popcorn. We did this every weekend during the school year, and even more now that we were free. Katie took her regular seat on the overstuffed recliner, kicking her sandals off and curling her legs beneath her. In keeping with her Memphis mood, Katie pushed in a terrible copy of a TV movie she'd recorded. It was one we'd seen dozens of times, so the black squiggly lines didn't bother me. We watched in a comfortable silence, only speaking to quote our favorite lines. "I wish Drew looked like Elvis," Katie sighed, hugging a throw pillow to her chest as the credits rolled. "Then I wouldn't care if he cheated." "I know, right?" I said, passing her a tissue. Even though we'd seen this movie 100 times and everyone in the world knew the outcome, we always got choked up at the end. But guys don't look like that anymore. "It's a shame, too," she sniffed, "because I have an uncanny resemblance to Anne Margaret," she said, sticking out her chest and giving her hips a suggestive shake. I laughed loud enough to wake up the house. "What does Lucas look like?" "More Leo than Dean," she said, rolling the bag of chips and sticking a clip on the end. "Don't worry, he's hot. You'll have a good time, I promise." She'd been pestering me for weeks to go out with another of Drew's friends, Lucas. I'd only recently given in, and I still had reservations, mostly because she became all dreamy-eyed when she talked about him. I'd seen those eyes before and couldn't help but wonder if she had a crush on him herself. Katie headed upstairs to call Drew while I cleaned the living room back to its original perfection, leaving Jenny's blocks strewn in the corner. Cleaning her toys was pointless. When I got upstairs, I was surprised not to find Katie in my room, though I shouldn't have been. She was a magnet for anything male. I should have known better than to send her upstairs, where unexpected Thomas slept. I whispered her name a couple of times into the dark hall to no response. Thomas's door was open, but I didn't want to go down there if I could help it. I could hear her laughing, so I went in my room and closed the door, reaching back too late to catch it from slamming. It shouldn't have bothered me that she felt comfortable enough to talk and laugh with him. After all, Thomas had been her friend too, but I couldn't help the surge of jealousy that struck me. I listened for her to come in while I showered, but the room was still empty when I climbed into bed sometime later. I'm not sure how long I'd been asleep when her voice woke me. "Breland," she whispered, nudging me as she climbed into bed. "Breland, you asleep?" "What?" I loosened the blanket from my legs. "Am I hogging the covers?" "No," she said, slipping her legs under the blanket and pressing her cold toes against my leg. I gave her a swift kick and turned back toward the wall. "Are you mad at me?" I didn't answer right away because I knew it was illogical to be mad at her. I wasn't dating Thomas. If she'd grabbed a pillow and headed down the hall, it wasn't my business. "I thought you were calling Drew." "The line was busy," she said. "And then I ran into Thomas coming out of the bathroom. If you don't want me to talk to him—" "I don't care if you talk to him," I sighed, punching the stuffing in my pillow instead of her face. "I just don't get why he can talk to everyone but me." "Whatever, I don't care," I said, shuffling away from her feet. "Go to sleep." "You know me and my mouth," she said sheepishly. "When have I ever needed another person to have a conversation?" "True," I allowed, bumping her with my butt. "Get your icebergs off of me." The next morning, Katie slept in. She didn't get the luxury at home. I finished breakfast and met Grayson at the pen. He was my newest riding recruit, a 10-year-old. He'd never stepped foot near a horse. He lived in Baltimore with his parents and was down for the summer visiting his grandparents. They'd paid for lessons for his birthday. I'd never given lessons to a boy, and I wasn't used to hyper. The girls were shy, at least the ones I'd dealt with. Grayson leapt onto Allendale before I'd finished my instructions. His papa and I watched as they trotted the length of the pen. At the end of the hour, I felt like all I'd done was supervise him while he rode in circles, but his papa seemed satisfied when he handed over the check. I took Allendale back to the barn and retrieved Addie. We rode out to where Daddy was working on the irrigation line. Sweat beaded on his forehead, and the skin beneath the thinning hair on top of his head was a painful shade of red. "Daddy, where's your hat?" I pulled the reins tight as the trees swayed heavily in the distance. "Wind caught it," he said, cursing the cracked tube in his hand. "I tried to get him to wear mine," Thomas spoke up, glancing up from the shovel in his hand long enough to wipe the sweat from his brow. "Do you want a burnt head too?" Daddy asked, shooting Thomas an annoyed glare. Thomas grinned under his hat. "I've got a little more up top then." "You like working here?" Daddy interrupted him. "You should take him up on it, Daddy," I encouraged. "It's not every day that Thomas loans his hat." The smile on Thomas's lips grew a little as he peered up at me. My heart fluttered as our eyes met for the briefest moment. "It's about to fall apart," he said, his hands busy at work again, "but it still does the job." Directing Addie around, I couldn't help but admire the way the muscles worked in Thomas's deeply tanned arms. He was so different than the boy I remembered, yet so much the same at times. "Don't stay out too long," I said to Daddy before turning Addie back to the barn. "Listen, Breland." Daddy stopped me before I got Addie into a full trot. He was on his feet, peering at me from beneath his hand. "I won't be here when you leave for your date tonight, but that don't mean that boy's off the hook. You pass that along." I nodded, catching sight of Thomas watching me intently from where he kneeled on the ground before starting forward again. "There won't be a second date without a sit-down," Daddy called after me.